I got lucky, so I was able to present a complete vision. And I don't think you get that anymore. I think you just get a lot of explosions, and you get a lot of characters running around, and then everybody sits back and says, "Okay, now we're going to sell some toys," and that's pretty much where it stands.
It's Deep Sea Dr. Octopus.
All right.
He dives off his raft to go after shark trap Spidey, but Spidey unleashes the evil symbiote shark on him. The new Spider-Man Web Splashers collection, each sold separately.
I was a relatively late bloomer when it came to Spider-Man fandom. Back in my day, Spider-Man wasn't the universally-loved merchandising juggernaut Batman was, and didn't come close until Fox's Spider-Man cartoon in 1994. I was 10 at the time, and while I had certainly heard of Spider-Man, and knew he was part of the Marvel pantheon of heroes, I had only collected DC comics so far, and was only aware of the X-Men on television. That series had already been running a couple years. I had a skewed image of Spider-Man because all I really had to go on was his image. And at that time in the comics world, the muscular, disproportionate, bug-eyed, almost sinister McFarlane Spider-Man was all the rage, as were Venom and Carnage. So when I did see Spider-Man in a magazine or on the rare opportunity I had to visit a comic shop, I had the impression he was a dark vigilante like Batman. But scarier. I went to a friend's birthday party in 1993, a fateful night, as it was my introduction to a whole superhero world apart from Batman and Superman. This kid was into everything, including Spawn. There would be no Spawn year without him, and he gave away comics as party favors. I don't know what issue I got. It might have been Amazing 346, that great Eric Larson cover, but I became creeped out and fascinated by the symbiotes, and it's been difficult to separate my Spider-Man fandom from that part of it ever since. So even though Peter Parker turned out to be a lighter, more jokey, more optimistic character than I'd expected, I was right at home when I saw the Fox animated series, which was heavily influenced, like X-Men, by the most recent stories and the contemporary flavor of that world over the Stan Lee era. Peter was already well out of high school, so it was years before I even knew his history started there. He was constantly fighting genetically engineered whack jobs and giant robots, and the whole thing was about the evils of playing God and ultimate power corrupting absolutely, which was more or less what I'd seen in what little I'd had the opportunity to read. I viewed the power and responsibility lesson entirely through that techno-thriller lens, and one of the first episodes I saw featured Venom, so I was sure that was Spider-Man's undisputed arch-nemesis. The 90s animated series was very much my Spider-Man, and it wasn't until I started collecting 70s and 80s Amazing that I realized what I was seeing on screen wasn't exactly how it happened in the comics. Because I thought it was a direct adaptation. I thought this about X-Men too, that if you saw the cartoon, you had essentially read all the important stuff in the comics. So I thought Hobgoblin was always the first Goblin, that Black Cat was always a super soldier, that Doc Ock always had a German accent, and I probably even thought Cletus Cassidy always got the Carnage symbiote by becoming a disciple of Dormammu. That was a strange choice. And I always thought of the Kingpin as a Spider-Man villain before he was a Daredevil villain, because he was always secretly behind everything in this show. It shaped my understanding and perspective of Spider-Man and the Marvel Universe at large, and to this day, this Kingpin and Spider-Man's voices are often the ones I have in my head when I read comics. It's also my definitive Doc Ock costume, and the versions I think of when I think of the Chameleon or Shocker. I have a lot of nostalgia for the show, both for what I remember as cool as well as hokey. I never forgot the sometimes CG-rendered buildings with hand-drawn characters in front of them. I always thought it was cool the show was trying to push the boundaries of animation, but that it was odd to do it if you couldn't do it all the time. Still, I come from the reboot generation. Computer-generated animation on TV was still a big deal in 1994, when 16-bit video games were still king and Toy Story was a year away. I remember the insane amount of flashbacks, which were either there to cut costs so you didn't need 21 whole minutes of brand new animation, or because, especially after the first season, the ongoing story seemed so involved to the producers they had to hold our hand and show us every relevant moment from the past or we'd be totally lost. Maybe both. Maybe the idea was that ongoing narratives were still rare enough on Saturday morning, the show was throwing intrusive flashbacks in to make sure anyone could watch an episode as it aired, regardless of whether they were keeping up. And honestly, often 2 or 3 episodes worth of story would be crammed into one, and plot points would happen at such a pace you almost needed those flashbacks to keep track of the soap opera. But it sometimes made a lot of episodes feel like clip shows, and it was always jarring. It was my least favorite thing about the show even as a kid, and it hasn't gotten any better with age. It's one of the things that most dates it. Another is what looks like a lot of paralyzing censorship, which I also noticed a little as a kid, and it's even more glaring to me now. It has that standard 80s, 90s cartoon rule of destroy but never kill. It can't even mention blood, even though the lyrics of the theme song repeatedly say spider blood, a point Eric pointed out to me, and he had to prove because I didn't believe him, and Spider-Man never throws a punch. Something else Eric noticed that I hadn't picked up on. The show is notorious for censorship issues, as it leads to a lot of goofiness and watered-down violence. It isn't that violence magically makes a story more sophisticated and smarter, but violence without consequences or dancing around what's really happening makes it less so, and can be insulting to kids' intelligence. If you have to replace Morbius's bloodlust with a thirst for plasma that he sucks out through his hands, why do vampires at all? Why do Carnage if you have to tiptoe around his being a deranged serial killer? Sure, Batman the Animated Series never depicts the Joker murdering anyone, but he's sufficiently sadistic and scary. We know the Joker toxin is lethal, and what's implied is often a lot more unsettling than anything we could see him do on screen. That usually felt subtle rather than sheltering. That show used the limitations of censorship to its advantage, while Spider-Man is often screaming for at least a PG rating. Simper claims in various interviews that fans have overblown this issue and that his hands weren't tied any further behind his back than anyone else's on other shows, and that baffles me. Even X-Men, which has some similar issues, doesn't suffer from this in the same way. It makes me wonder if another producer or someone else on staff was overly protective of children's sensibilities, and if maybe it was some kind of self-censorship, because that's a constant through the series, and on rewatch, it holds it back from telling the kinds of crime drama and often sci-fi horror-derived stories it wants to tell effectively at best, and it leads to unintentionally hilarious choices at worst. There are plenty of things I still love about the show. Tons of great quips. This is one of the funnier Peter Parkers in costume. Often a pretty good sense of continuity, and while the animation can be hit and miss, every couple of episodes, there's an undeniably great poster-worthy shot of Spider-Man perching, or swinging, or brooding. But I must admit, it was sometimes painful to revisit. It often takes itself far too seriously, especially in the later seasons, and loses sight of how melodramatic it is. Early on, it's more self-aware and has some fun with the soap opera, but eventually, the melodramatic dialogue and constant hand-holding gets cringeworthy. Spider-Man is, at its core, about the interpersonal relationships first and the action second. It's supposed to be a coming-of-age story about a kid who isn't sure who he is and what he wants, struggling with everyday problems and trying to be a selfless superhero, as he finds himself. This show knows that. Peter isn't perfect, and he makes the kinds of mistakes you or I might, but that plays better in the big fights. The relationship drama is often superficial, paid lip service to, and is often even handled off-screen, almost pretending like we were there for it. I can't keep track of which girl, Mary Jane or Felicia Hardy, Peter is more interested in or dating in the first season. And sometimes it's totally inconsistent about it. He'll ask one out and be going on a date with the other next episode. He looks unintentionally like he's playing them both for a while. And once he's finally with Mary Jane, she's a lot more airheaded and one note than she was in the first few episodes. And yes, the Hydro clone is much more that way. At one point saying the basis of the relationship is that Peter will always rescue her, because that's healthy, but turning around and acting like she's independent and can take care of herself. I don't have any reason to think the clone is not exactly like the real Mary Jane, who I've never had a solid handle on, and Miles Warren's Hydro-Man clone is as psychotic and delusional as the original, so I'm assuming she's a perfect copy. And then there's Harry Osborn, who we hardly see Peter spend any time with, and then suddenly he's Peter's best friend, and it's hard to appreciate his tragedy when Norman drives him insane, because prior to that, he only shows up when it's time to move him on to the next stage of his development artificially. It's often a really plot-driven character-driven show that tells us how character-driven it is, with ideas that sound great in Peter's internal monologue, but which the show doesn't take the time to realize in the action. So this is the first show I'm giving this treatment that I can't call overall excellent. Before, it's always been highlighting some of the greats in an overall solid to brilliant show. The episodes on this list are still plagued to varying degrees by the most egregious mistakes it made as a series, but there's plenty to recommend them, and some of the silly stuff, intentional or otherwise, is part of the charm. There's also plenty of interesting story ideas to analyze. As always, I do my best to employ historical perspective, but we've had a superior Spider-Man on screen, poor choice of words, with Spectacular, which I look forward to taking a fine-tooth comb to down the road. And there seems to be a consensus among most fans that that series has eclipsed this one as, to date, the definitive animated version. I would agree. I think fans tend to be harsher on this show than they once were, because that's put it into perspective, and seeing a more sophisticated adaptation of something you love can make it hard to appreciate what came before, for its era's sensibilities and standards. So while I wish it had aged better and watched more like the serious and gripping Spider-Man show I thought I was watching, a little like the original animated Ninja Turtles, we'll get there, I'll always have a soft spot for it as the show that cemented my love for the character and got me thinking about the unintended consequences, good or bad, of actions you take with the best of intentions. I'm going to handle this list in a different and kind of unorthodox way. Since this series is more serialized and continuitous than the other shows I've done these for, I'm going to present my list in chronological order. I'll be referencing some of the events that occur in one in my discussion of episodes that linearly fall later, especially episodes from the second and third seasons, and it'll be easier to follow the analysis in aired order. I'll still rank the episodes, but you'll hear about them out of ranked orders, so you may not have to wait for the end to see the number one pick. I'm also counting multi-part episodes as one, and multi-parters compete with singles to be included. After the first season, most episodes are at least in 2 parts. And no, I don't consider a season arc with a header a single episode. There are multi-part arcs with their own titles inside Neogenic Nightmare, Sins of the Fathers, and Partners in Danger. I should also mention that this show, at the time of this recording, still hasn't been released on video in the United States, but is currently available for streaming with a Hulu subscription, along with X-Men and even Spider-Man Unlimited, which is how I watched it for this episode. Growing up, I heard it most commonly referred to as Spider-Man the Animated Series, but officially, Fox titled it simply Spider-Man. Curiously, Hulu lists it as Marvel Comics Spider-Man, I guess because the logo at the time had the word comics in it, which is strange and misleading, as that implies, as I believed as a kid, that it's directly adapting the comics to screen. Spoiler alert, Electro wasn't the son of the Red Skull in the comics. But happily, it is on Hulu in its entirety, and the renders look great. Okay, enough lengthy internal monologue. It's time to swing into action. My third pick is Mysterio's debut episode, The Menace of Mysterio. Comics veteran Marv Wolfman is co-created for story this episode, and he may have a lot to do with why the show seems to finally come to life for me 5 episodes in. Wolfman's run, which lasted from issue 182 to 204, circa 1979 and 1980, includes a lot of material that influenced the show, including some of the Spider Slayer and Smythe stuff, a Rocket Racer and Big Wheel story, and probably his most important contribution, the creation of Black Cat. His run also includes a really eerie 2-part Mysterio story that heavily informs his take here on the villain, filled with a lot of the creepy and surreal kinds of imagery we get a little here, and which also sees Mysterio using holographic illusions rather than relying on only physical props and practical effects as he does when Stan Lee introduces him. Quentin Beck frames Spider-Man for a museum robbery, wanting to get even with Spider-Man for busting him for putting a cast and crew's lives in danger with overly elaborate pyrotechnics when he worked as a special effects man. Odd to see this show attempting social commentary about the superficiality of Hollywood and how movies are all about the explosions rather than telling stories, but I like that it improves on Mysterio's comic origin by making Spider-Man personally connected to and indirectly responsible for his machinations. Like in Stan Lee's original story, Mysterio pretends to be a hero and gains Jameson's favor as a real hero that wants to take down the man Jameson's labeled a menace from the beginning, and he seems to almost admire Mysterio's self-aggrandizing. Peter considers giving up the crime-fighting gig. It's easier to just walk away than to keep trying to help people in an infamous costume when everyone, including his aunt, thinks he's a criminal. And this is the first of many times, of course, as we do in a lot of Spider-Man continuities, where he's going to try to give up the costume. But Lieutenant Lee, looking for Spider-Man after he's gone AWOL and thinking Peter can help, convinces him to take on Mysterio. She's seen Spider-Man in action and knows he's on the right side of the law. Of course, unbeknownst to her, when she says it's too bad none of Spider-Man's character rubbed off on Peter, she's talking about two conflicting sides of the same man's personality. That's my favorite line in the episode. So Peter takes Mysterio down on his own turf in Wonder Studios, not to be confused with Wonder City in the Arkham franchise. Mysterio has no steampunk robots, nor is he trying to use technology to extend life and create a utopia. Like most of Spider-Man's villains that aren't the Kingpin, he's not much of a big picture guy. He does have some other robots, though, including a giant spider that, as Beck says, ironically catches Spider-Man in its web. I realize this world is chock full of spider slayers and neogenics and whatnot, but if a regular Hollywood special effects wizard has all this advanced technology in his arsenal, how hasn't Hollywood made more gigantic strides by the mid-90s? Spider-Man brings up Ray Harryhausen and Roger Corman in a great one-liner toward the end, so he's living in a heightened version of our contemporary world. If you have perfectly realistic holograms, there's no excuse for bad green screen or poorly integrated CGI or cartoon Jeff Bridges passed off as the genuine article. Beck could have saved us from The Mummy Returns, the Clash of the Titans remake, and Green Lantern. I guess he's like a magician, and he won't reveal his incredible advances in visual effects. You know, just in case he wanted to use them in an elaborate scheme to destroy a superhero's reputation. Because you just never know when that might come up. This episode is filled with creative and memorable uses of Beck's holotech, especially when Mysterio reveals himself and pretends to take his own head off, and the yellow brick road that doesn't lead anywhere. Mysterio doesn't come off as lame and corny, as is often his reputation, even as Spider-Man makes fun of the fishbowl on his head. Peter gets that it's all smoke and mirrors, but I think he's also a little unnerved and weirded out by some of what Mysterio throws at him, so he tries to combat that with logic and humor. Imagine trying to fight a bad guy in the boat ride at Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. The episode is evocative of the moody pseudo-horror tone of the period Wolfman wrote in, and throughout its run, the show tends to bounce back and forth between that and the wild, high-octane techno-thriller vibe it had through a lot of the 90s. But it also brings the character back to its Lee Ditko roots by finally revealing Uncle Ben's death and introducing the "with great power comes great responsibility" credo, which is curiously absent the first 4 episodes. The theme of responsibility is alluded to earlier, with mad science gone rampant, like with the Lizard, the Kingpin dripping with power and using it for his own gain at the expense of men he uses only as means to ends, like Alistair Smythe, all contrasted with Peter, who tries to use his power to help people regardless of his crummy public image. But unless you're already familiar with the character, I doubt you'd pick up on the central theme until this episode. Not just because it's spelled out in Uncle Ben's now infamously overused mantra, but also because Peter goes through a clear character arc that's all about stepping up and putting yourself on the line when it's easier in the moment to make problems you have the power to extinguish someone else's. Contrasted with Mysterio, who has no sense of accountability and blames Spider-Man for his incarceration when he almost got a bunch of people killed and totally deserved it. While it's a smarter and more compelling story than a lot of these, it doesn't fully avoid those weird, inappropriately melodramatic moments the show is infamous for. My favorite of those here is the swelling cymbal crash in the last scene, as Mary Jane tells Peter she's passed her physics test because, as Peter just did in deciding not to give up being Spider-Man and facing Mysterio, she only had to realize it's all about making sense out of life. This show is never going to not spell out a moral like that, and you just kind of get used to it. Wait, wouldn't biology be more about making sense out of life? Yeah, but anyway, that cymbal crash, it's like I was supposed to be on pins and needles the whole episode, wondering about how she did on her test, and I'm supposed to squeal for joy when I finally know she passed it. It's like Smallville making an ongoing plot point about Lana living in Chloe Sullivan's house, or that stupid Vulcan neuropressure soap opera with DePaul and Shrip in Season 3 Enterprise. I'd like to retitle that season The Neuropressure Nightmare. It's the first solid, character-driven story of the series, one of the more thematically cohesive shows, and one of the easiest to take seriously and dismiss some of those cornier elements that plague this series. Next up already, it's my number 1 pick, the 3-part episode from Season 1, The Alien Costume. In a podcast interview on the Amazing Spider Talk just last year, showrunner John Semper talks a lot about the constraints put on him by the network during the first season, and how Fox loosened the reins as it continued because it wasn't the new toy storytelling anymore. He says the executives didn't want any continuous storytelling or human drama, just standalone, action-packed episodes. I'm sure that was a problem, but I'm not sure that was the main culprit of the show's most glaring issues. And with all due respect, I take some of what Semper says with a grain of salt, because the ultra-deep, bordering on Shakespearean storytelling he describes is not the same show I'm watching, and he kind of implies that his Spider-Man show holds up better than Lost. Semper says there's a tight and clear character arc that's trackable from start to finish, about a guy who's totally unsure of himself, who learns confidence and humility gradually and naturally over 5 seasons. That's not really the Peter we start with. He's overly confident and cocky, as he is in this 3-parter, and he grows out of that in some key episodes where that message is overtly stated in internal monologue, especially anytime Madam Web is involved. But I always feel like I need those intrusive speeches to check in with where Peter is supposed to be on that journey he's supposed to be going through, because I'm not seeing it naturally play out. And if Fox stopped tying his hands behind his back, there's really no excuse not to allow Peter to evolve over the seasons and to do it in a more sophisticated way. And with some notable exceptions, most of them on this list, the quality of the storytelling rarely exceeds what's done with this episode. Semper's comments are ironic, given that my favorite episode is a multi-part from the first season, where he apparently had less creative control. I'm partial to this episode partly due to a massive nostalgia wave that moves through me whenever I watch it. I remember this as a big event, along with the likes of the Dark Phoenix saga in X-Men and Green with Evil in Power Rangers. That's another reason it's strange to imagine this as an early Season 1 episode. I didn't see it when it aired, and never kept up with the show in order, so that was a surprise to me when I revisited the series for this rewind. It makes sense that Semper would want to get Venom in the villain lineup quickly, given his immense popularity in the comics. From the pilot, viewers would be anticipating his arrival, teased with the striking image of Venom at the end of the intro each episode, which, like all the shots used there, comes directly from the episode. You're practically suggesting Venom is Spider-Man's arch nemesis, like I thought when I was a kid, throwing that menacing snarl in right before the logo, like he's the Shredder or Gargamel. And while I appreciate that the show doesn't use Venom as a crutch and overuse him, he only has one follow-up after this. Man, it seems only fair to front-load him like this after the anticipation you're building with that intro. I'm not just putting this in the #1 spot because I love Venom and this was my favorite as a kid, though. It makes a great case for making Venom part of Peter's early development, facing his mirror image in Eddie Brock, a man who wants the same things he wants: money, a girlfriend, notoriety, but has no sense of responsibility and blames everyone else for his problems. Peter faces the ultimate test of his values when he's given more power than he can imagine and has to fight an alien influence that gets in his mind and tells him to ignore every consequence of his actions. Once he passes that series of trials, he has to take down Brock, who embraces that influence and power and literally becomes the monster Peter was in danger of becoming if he allowed himself to kill or destroy the Rhino or Shocker. You know, like he actually kills Sandman in Spider-Man 3 and just gets lucky that it doesn't take. I like a younger Peter, relatively. We don't get a high school version here, but it's still toward the beginning of his career, who is getting cocky with his abilities, is starting to get entitled, and expects praise or rewards for doing the right thing, forced to take a good hard look at himself. The Venom symbiote is a perfect device to give Peter a sense of perspective, as he's still, at least for the sake of this episode, unsure of what sort of man he is and how seductive power can be. I like Venom as a constant check against Peter's self-absorption and ambition for fame and fortune. After he manages to reject the costume and Brock bonds with it, Venom's face becomes his waking nightmare, an image that lingers from that surreal dream he has when he first gets the suit, and incidentally, some of the best animation in the series. Venom is the monster he created that Brock has allowed himself to become, the twisted, perverse Spider-Man that stands for everything Peter fights against. And I like that at the end, even after he separated Brock and Venom and sent the symbiote into space, where it should never be able to return, unless more astronauts bring it back as a souvenir, and Peter is trying to go about his life again, he still sees that face in the moon, the image of what he almost became, and the monster he knows he had the capacity to become still haunting him. These episodes are, for me, the most well-paced of the series and should have been the gold standard moving forward. There are a lot of multi-part episodes and longer ones that feel really hurried and sloppy in their plotting, like the 6 Forgotten Warriors, which watches like an entire year of comics crammed into 6 episodes. Sometimes I'd blink and an episode had already wrapped up all its threads. Threads already felt like I needed some kind of chart to keep straight in the first place. But this story feels like it's precisely the length it needs to be, and it takes its time to develop its ideas as well as its atmosphere, so it doesn't play like a clip show you're supposed to fill in the gaps to. And it feels like an event, material Semper and his team have reverence for and are enthusiastic about finally bringing to a television audience. That's partly because they take advantage of how massive a threat Venom naturally is for Peter, and that he makes mistakes that make it worse. The longer the symbiote is with Peter, the more it knows about him. So, of course, Brock as Venom knows Spider-Man's identity and can wreak all kinds of havoc on his life. It's the first villain who knows his secret, and seeing his life almost totally unravel like this so early, it's a little hard to be taken in by the zillion commercial break cliffhangers we'll get after this, where a villain is about to unmask or expose Peter. Speaking of, it's a good thing Jameson sucks at technology or the show would be over. If your subject has to be perfectly still to take a picture in focus, how does Peter get all those action shots of Spider-Man in the first place? I don't think Venom would have been as big a deal outside comic audiences without this show, and that's a testament to how relatively scary he is, especially given all those perceived censorship issues. I mean, this is the episode where Spider-Man in the black costume tortures the Rhino for information by flipping him upside down, sticking his horn in the ground, and spinning him around until he talks. And yet, somehow, Peter comes off as sufficiently menacing, and it's unsettling to see him coming unglued like this, at least in the context of this show. Unhinged Peter gets hilarious, and I'm not sure how intentional that is, like Emo Peter in Spider-Man 3, but it is more self-aware about the silliness than a lot of this show is. He starts doing an 80s mobster voice in the clock tower when he threatens to murder the Shocker. I would watch a whole What If season with this Spider-Man. Shocker says, "You'll pay for that," and Spider-Man's comeback is, "The check's in the mail, baby!" These guys are having a lot of fun with this material, and that extends to Venom, whose sense of humor is consistent with that. In one scene, Peter shoots webbing at him and he says, "Streamers? Now it is a party!" I also love the distortion effect on his voice. That's forevermore what Venom sounds like in my head. The way the symbiote gets to Earth is totally different in the comics, of course, where he picks up the black costume off-world during the Secret Wars event. And it's odd that the show finally adapts Secret Wars in the last season. This is a good alternative, though. John Jameson and his NASA team accidentally pick up the symbiote a la Alien in space, and Peter ends up with it after saving the shuttle. That's how Spider-Man 3 should have handled it. There's nothing too convenient about his getting the costume, and it provides the perfect device for a character arc about getting too big for your britches. It's not close to perfect, certainly. Brock's vendetta against Spider-Man doesn't make a lot of sense. I like the idea that the opposite of Spider-Man is a guy who points the finger at someone else, rather than holding himself accountable for his mistakes. But Brock is a total loose cannon, and his maybe being deranged or unhinged is an excuse for his irrational behavior before it's a reason. Wouldn't it be more interesting if we knew how he got this way? What is the anti-Spider-Man origin for Brock? Why is he as devoted to being irresponsible as Peter is to being responsible? Now, to be fair, Brock has this problem in the comics too, but it was unfortunately a wasted opportunity to develop his motivations and make him less of a plot device. Also, another shuttle launch at the end so Spider-Man can swiftly use the vibrations of the rocket engines to separate Brock from the symbiote and get rid of it is pretty convenient and easy. Oh, and I don't think Semper and the other writers are putting themselves in Mary Jane's shoes here. Peter makes her leave the theater before their show starts because Brock's there taunting them. He can't tell her anything without revealing he's Spider-Man, so he does the typical gallant movie hero thing, asks her if she trusts him, and tells her to do what he says without question. She reluctantly agrees. At the end, he spaces off as they're looking up at the stars, and she's trying to talk to him. Mary Jane should really reevaluate this relationship from where she's sitting. This guy doesn't tell her anything, barks orders, treats her like a piece of luggage, and when the danger seems to have passed, forgets she's even there. I'd be asking a lot of questions if it were me. There's a lot of nut jobs out there, and her boyfriend just might be one of them. But this three-parter remains the most watchable and engaging of the series to me, and it's one of the things, again, that got me interested in Spider-Man in the first place. Without it, I'm not sure I would be much of a Spider-Man fan at all. My number 6 pick is the Insidious Six and Battle of the Insidious Six. No idea why that couldn't have just been Insidious Six Part 1 and 2. This show is at its best when it doesn't take itself too seriously, and this is about as fun as it gets. Doc Ock pretending to run a free health clinic to hold Aunt May hostage without her knowing it. Rhino thinking Spider-Man was a robot the whole time after Kingpin tests his new team with a fake, and Scorpion in a trench coat. What's not to love? The bombastic cartoon criminal intrigue is dialed up to 11 when we learn Kingpin runs a whole crime syndicate and they're unhappy with him because even though profits are up, Spider-Man's still all up in their business and Kingpin has failed to destroy him, or annihilate him, or eradicate him. All those words come up here, but kill remains too explicit. So in order to appease the cartel, Fisk breaks all the major villains from last season out of jail, except for Venom because his costume is out in space. So we've got Rhino, Scorpion, Shocker, Mysterio, Chameleon, and Dr. Octopus, each a criminal with his own ambition that tried to go up against Spider-Man alone and failed. Well, some of them worked for Kingpin already, and most of them are just motivated by Lincolns and Benjamins, but they did all work separately and were no match for Spider-Man by themselves. I don't know how Fisk manages to remain anonymous when he lets everyone who works for him see his very well-known, wealthy philanthropist face, and they all end up double-crossing him or going their own way. When this is all said and done, the whole Insidious Six leaves, with really compromising information about the Kingpin, and he just lets them go. Must be easy running all the crime in the world when everyone on the planet seems to be a dunderhead or a malodorless bungler or an absurdly dressed pitiful excuse for a man. I love Doc Ock's endless barrage of insults, by the way. And yeah, we're told early on in first season that the Kingpin runs all the crime. All the crime! Hilariously, Shocker is lying in his cell wearing his costume, but Scorpion is not, even though in his origin episode, he was a product of one of Dr. Stillwell's neogenics procedures, fusing his DNA with a scorpion's, a villain cocktail ordered by J. Jonah Jameson. No wonder he gets kidnapped all the time. Karma isn't kind to people who ruin people's lives by turning them into scorpion men to take out their enemies. He is wearing a suit when he gets fused with a scorpion, but he is a mutated scorpion man. He didn't seem to be able to take that suit off before. When he comes back later after Tablet of Time, which is weirdly often, by the way, we remember his origin again, and he doesn't seem to be able to take that suit off, desperate to become normal again. This is one of the show's better examples of juggling a lot of characters without losing the viewer, which I think it does a lot. It helps that we're already familiar with the Six, who all seem to have a lot more personality now as they're bickering with each other than they did alone, besides the mute except when morphed Chameleon. But it also introduces some new players for the ongoing narrative, and they don't feel shoved in or underdeveloped because everything doesn't have to wrap up with a bow at the end. The Insidious Six stuff is a complete story, but this also serves as the first 2 chapters of the most 90s comic section of this show, the Neogenic Nightmare, and a lot of the season's major elements are well seated here. It doesn't feel like we're interrupting the story to start telling another one. The A story hinges on the impetus for the ongoing narrative, which is Peter losing his powers due to, as he discovers at the end of this, a mutation disease that he got from the spider bite that gives him his powers. Everything that's going to unfold over the Neogenics arc is set up here, including Morbius, who will become the living vampire with the Neogenic Recombinator. His tragic relationship with Felicia begins here. Silvermane is introduced, and it alludes to his obsession with immortality when Fisk emphasizes how old he is, and Connors even mentions a potential grant from the Toomes Foundation for Neogenics research. Adrian Toomes is the Vulture, another old man preoccupied with being young again, who will wreak havoc in the season finale. This season does have some weird continuity hiccups, but it's relatively well plotted and impressively thought out from the beginning. Peter losing his powers is one of the big highlights of the show for me, and it seems to be a thing that sticks with people. I think the popularity of this material probably had something to do with Peter losing his powers in Spider-Man 2. Here, it isn't related to insecurities or lack of confidence, though he does learn a lot about his priorities and how easy it is to lose yourself in desperation, a state that can be just as corrupting as having too much power. His loss of power serves 3 great story functions. It's the start of an ongoing mystery. Can Peter be Spider-Man forever, and what is he turning into? It provides a more massive obstacle to overcome in the Insidious Six. Hard enough to fight 6 powerful opponents as Spider-Man, but how can he possibly face them as Peter Parker? And it gives him a taste of normality, teasing him with a life without the kind of responsibility he's been forced into. He has to make another typical superhero sacrifice here when he loses the chance to date Felicia to Morbius, the wannabe vampire, because he's too busy pretending to be Peter, pretending to be Spider-Man, so he can outwit the Insidious Six, which unmasks him without his powers. Peter can't get a break, and he'd love to lose his powers altogether and pursue his own natural desires. At one point, he thinks he's through having to fight crime or save people. What's the point without powers? But toward the end, he can't help but save the sweet old man kidnapped by the Kingpin, who is really the ruthless crime boss Silvermane, but he doesn't know that. See? Intrigue! and he does that despite his powers flaking out constantly. It would be easier to run away and let Kingpin have the old man, but that's not in Peter's character, regardless of his powers. That's also classic Spider-Man. Saving Silvermane will come back to bite him later, because sometimes there are negative consequences for doing the right thing. You can't control what a person does with a second chance once you give it to them, but that doesn't mean, for Peter, that you don't have the obligation to give it to them. I like the way the show handles the Six Arms and Man-Spider for the most part, though that wraps up a little quickly maybe, but this one inched those out because of how enjoyable all the villain stuff is. Spider-Man has one of his best quips this episode, too. When Doc Connors asks if he was born with his powers, he says no, he won them in a quiz show, and neogenics was the category he chose. And I have to mention the Chameleon's hologram belt, which allows him to look and sound like anyone, or at least I always thought it was a hologram. Later, Professor Not Two-Face Landon will genetically engineer him so he can shapeshift at will, and then nobody can tell he's the Chameleon based on that conspicuous belt buckle, although they hardly ever did anyway. And side note, if you can give the Chameleon that ability, why not just have an army of shape-changing henchmen? What I want to know is if he can project a coat over the projector on the belt and the facade still holds, why can't he camouflage the belt buckle itself with whatever else he's projecting? And while we're on the subject, why does there seem to be this weird unspoken rule that if S.H.I.E.L.D. is in an episode, the Chameleon must be too? This one has a bit of a summer blockbuster feel, and it has a lot in common with the best of those. Big, creative action scenes, tons of banter and repartee, and a compelling hero who has big odds to overcome and does it mostly with brains and ingenuity. My fifth pick is The Mutant Agenda. It's hard not to include this two-parter since it watches partly like an X-Men episode, and is penned by Michael Eddins, who wrote 8 episodes of that show. And X-Men was the better of the two shows. And I don't mean those characters suddenly take over and Spider-Man's relegated to the sidelines. While it's awkward to suddenly hear all the prejudice anti-mutant talk from X-Men in this show, just because we're suddenly dealing with the mutation and the X-Men, it does a lot of what I think the best TV crossovers do well. It doesn't lose sight of what the show it's in is all about. The guest characters serve the protagonist and his series, and it doesn't feel like a throwaway episode for the sake of a gimmick. It is odd that there's a major revelation here for Beast that makes this a much-watched episode for X-Men viewers, to the point where I could have seen including it in the DVD box sets. The genocidal scheme against mutants is based on research he did years ago, hoping to rid himself of his mutancy. Again, he doesn't take over. He serves as the damsel in distress, basically, and spends most of the episode as a bird in an electrified gilded cage, to paraphrase Beast. Between the two shows, Beast gets kidnapped almost as often as J. Jonah Jameson, or at least as often as the Penguin steals the Batmobile. And his background serves as a cautionary tale for Peter, who is desperate for a cure for his own mutation, as Hank once was, and needs to be careful about the consequences of mucking around with science. He has no idea what he'll turn into. He could become a monster by doing nothing, or he could make himself a lot worse, which later on is exactly what's going to happen. Hank's past is caught up with him, and he's having to face the, everybody say it with me, responsibility of his actions, a position Peter knows all about and should be wary of repeating. It feels sufficiently like an event, and indeed, with all the references Spider-Man frequently makes to other characters in this unsung shared Marvel universe that existed long before we did it on the silver screen, it's nice to finally feature some of them, and peel the curtain of that larger world back a bit for Peter. We do a lot more of that with the Secret War in the last season, but it's not handled nearly as well. This isn't too formulaic of a crossover with your standard supervillain team-up, although it does open with an obligatory superhero fight, and things are contrived to keep it going and to feature the whole X team so it can bookend with them, fighting against each other initially, then together in common cause at the end. I don't know that it really needs any X-Men beyond Xavier, Wolverine, and Beast, and the others feel really shoehorned in, especially at the beginning, when they all show up and pose for a pin-up poster, and then fight off Sentinels when Spider-Man winds up in the holodeck, or danger room. Jean could have just gone to the control room and turned it off from the beginning, unless she had to traverse the program to reach the control room. I'm fuzzy on that, but that seems like a really poor design. The main villain here, while it seems to be the Kingpin as per usual, is Professor Landon, who Kingpin thinks is building an army of mutants to do his bidding because he's had such a great track record of controlling superpowered minions in the past. And perhaps he shouldn't make all those shape-shifting henchmen I suggested earlier. Landon is actually trying to eradicate all of mutant kind because reasons. He wants to purify the human race. He's kind of a Nazi. Not sure why. And after he becomes Two-Face at the end here, that obsession will never come up again. For the several seasons he remains in the Kingpin's employ. There's a three-pronged war going on between these two and the Hobgoblin, who Landon is paying to keep quiet about his scheme, and it wants to be a complex chess game, but it plays more like it needs at least one costume criminal to validate its time slot on Saturday morning television. But I can't complain. I love Mark Hamill's Hobgoblin, and this is one of his better episodes. Hobgoblin just wants everything, and he works at it with such glee and style and gall, sometimes you almost just want to give it to him. I especially like the bit where he steals Landon's research and puts a 3D animated goblin head virus on the computer. He did that just by pressing a couple of buttons. This guy is a genius. I like bringing up the mutants in relation to Peter's dilemma and exploring the difference between what they are versus what's happening to him. He thinks of mutation as a condition, and Xavier has to explain to him that for people born that way, it's natural, and he's taken it on himself to help them learn to control and accept their gifts. That's not as simple for Peter, who is, like a whole bunch of characters in this show, a victim of irresponsible science, and he may not have the luxury of learning to live with it. I can somewhat empathize with him as he's panicking, and even as he's wallowing in self-pity initially, beginning to relegate himself to the idea that he's about to be an uncontrollable monster, mostly because he snaps out of it and becomes proactive after he decides to look into what Hank tells him about Landon's research. I don't understand, though, why he doesn't immediately jump at Hank's offer minutes after he's just yelled at an old man because the world never seems to be there for him when he needs it. And I'm a little lost on the logic of the ultimate resolution to his character arc, which is going to get help like he does at the beginning. He didn't go about it the right way, but he never tried to solve this problem on his own. I guess the idea is that he forgot he had friends, and he had to make new ones out of the people he tried to use to get what he wants, which is what separates him from someone like the Kingpin, who only uses people for his own ends and trusts no one. But it's handled a little sloppily. Although he does have to spend some time cleaning up his own mess and proving to Wolverine that he didn't kidnap Beast and that he can be trusted. So I like that there are consequences to the way he treated them and that he has to learn how to be a friend. Landon's plot is classic mad science stuff. Landon, played by one of my favorite Trek alum actors, the great David Warner. And while he's a really traditional X-Men villain, another of those extreme personalities that hates and fears what he can't understand, he also encapsulates all the big ideas in this show. The villain that tries to play God to make himself the strongest to ensure his survival and pays the ultimate price by losing his own humanity. Although this guy kind of gets it back, even though he remains partially mutated. And again, I hate that we never talk about his hatred for mutants again. I guess he just becomes an opportunist and starts doing what the Kingpin wanted from him in the first place. He makes him artificially mutated soldiers like Smythe and the Ultimate Spider Slayer. See, everybody turns into the embodiment of their lack of responsibility to nature and mankind in this show. Except for the Kingpin, who by the end, I think should have become literally a black hole. Landon has an assistant named Genevieve, a name that sounds like it was invented for secretaries in noir movies, and she spends the whole episode spouting Landon's rhetoric like she's trying to convince herself. Beast says, "Methinks the lady doth protest too much." Turns out she is a mutant, a telekinetic, which is a decent reveal and well-seated, minus the umpteenth in case you weren't paying attention flashback. And I think the episode goes a lot darker with her than it realizes. At one point, she says, if they don't exist, they can't feel pain. I think she can't stand the bigotry and stigma against her kind, and instead of trying to hide in plain sight and help destroy mutants while she lives on, no one the wiser, as it might play if you forget some of the things she says before we know she's a mutant, she wants to die, and thinks the rest of her kind are better off dead because they must all feel the same pain she does. Wow. See? It's an X-Men episode. Although it's making the list, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this episode commits one of the show's cardinal sins in the most egregious way it's ever committed. This one holds the record for at least amount of time into an episode before flashback. Although there's one more later that I think might tie it. Spider-Man is swinging through trees, says, "I've never been more frightened in my life." Then immediately we flash back to Connors giving him bad news. 5 whole seconds. Good lord. What's worse, it's retroactively rewriting a scene with the same animation but different dialogue and pretending like we've seen it already. In Insidious 6, Connor says Peter was mutating and he might lose his powers for good. Now, he says he may be transforming into something that isn't human, and he's suddenly freaking out about it after things were going really well for him last episode. I guess he forgot all about that news while he was helping Mary Jane with her waterlogged psycho ex-boyfriend. Or maybe that was because that wasn't the news until this episode. Oh well, beyond everything else I mentioned to justify its inclusion on the list, it deserves a spot just for the hilarity of Spider-Man and Wolverine rolling around on the ground, throwing no punches, and Hobgoblin calling it a fight to the bitter end. My 9th pick is Shriek of the Vulture and the Final Nightmare. As silly as the finale of Neogenic Nightmare plays out, it wends its way onto my top 10 mostly due to thematic and character work. It's one of the weirder episodes, but it uses its weirdness to creatively illustrate the difference between Peter and a lot of his villains. It's also the closest the show comes to seeing Peter naturally mature over the course of a serialized story. Peter has to literally mature to prove how much he's emotionally matured, putting others before himself, and the universe rewards him for it, while his enemies, all older but not wiser, remain totally out for themselves, willing to destroy lives in the name of being young again, or normal again, or whole again, and they all pay a price for it. Adrian Toomes becomes the Vulture when Norman Osborn tries to buy his company out from under him, telling his board that Toomes' ideas of a personal aviation suit and de-aging technology are unviable, and he's wasting gazillions of dollars on them. Because, those two things go together like beans and cornbread. Toomes could just prove his ideas work, at least the flying machine, but instead, he flies around stealing the youth force out of people with technology derived from the Tablet of Time, which he got from Tombstone last episode, so he has the strength to murder Osborn. That's how Toomes pronounces it. Osborn. He has lots of these weird idiosyncrasies in his speech. Youth Force sounds like a bad and redundant Power Rangers season. So anyway, he goes all Defoe Goblin on this series' pre-Green Goblin. Yep, all that Hobgoblin, and he's still just a greedy, heartless CEO with funky cornrow hair, and drops him to his doom in an airplane hangar. Toomes used to be a pilot, see, so he's all in his element and stuff. Spider-Man saves Osborn, but Toomes keeps coming, eventually stealing Peter's youth force and turning him into an old man. It's that second part that makes this episode great for the list, is Peter has to continue living up to his responsibilities as an elderly man. Earlier in the season, when he was desperate for a cure to his mutation disease, Peter might have ignored people who needed his help, and he might have let his pride and ego get in the way of relying on the kindness of others. But he does both here. I think because he's realizing how much he took what he had for granted when he complained about having to take treatments from the Neogenic Recombinator every day to keep himself stable. He mentions that at the beginning. Now he can barely get around, but he keeps running into opportunities to help others despite his condition. I really like the scene in the alley where he saves a conveniently placed mugging victim from some thugs. The old woman, admittedly pretty comically, says, "I had no idea you were a senior citizen." And he responds with, "It's the job. It ages you." And when May offers him coffee in one of Peter's sweaters, not recognizing him, he has a newfound respect, again, for a part of his life he took for granted. A woman who had a hand in raising him to be the hero he is, rather than the vengeful criminal he could have been after Ben's death, and with his immense power. Aunt May maybe should have been tipped off a little bit, though, given that the sweater she gives elderly Peter looks just like the t-shirt he's wearing. And if I'm not reading too far into it, maybe he has a newfound appreciation for getting older and how difficult it is to stick to your principles all those years. This is probably the most likable and the most personality Aunt May gets, which is still almost none. She's just a more pleasant plot device than she's been previously. This isn't just the obligatory rapid aging episode of a sci-fi show, but the end of the whole Neogenic Nightmare arc, which works somewhat thematically, but again is easy and ridiculous. Scorpion just happens to choose this moment to break Stillwell out of a mental institution and try to force him to make him normal again, even though he could take that outfit off the last time we saw him. And Vulture and Scorpion form an uneasy alliance to cure them both. Toomes has Spider-Man's youth and powers, but he also acquired his mutation disease, which periodically transforms him into Man-Spider and back again. I guess it works differently, so he still has his faculties about him, which he needs to, to have a villain team up. So Connors, in a double cross when the villains think they're controlling him, somehow uses the Neogenic Recombinator to transfer Spider-Man's youth and powers back to him, while keeping the mutation disease in the Vulture, and Stillwell destroys the Recombinator so no one can make any more of these crazy monsters, thus wrapping up both of the season's plot threads simultaneously, and making Connors even more morally ambiguous than he was before. Yeah, Toombs is a bad guy, but is it really fair to leave the mutation disease in him? But that's really his solution? I'll just leave the mutation disease in this jerkface guy who probably deserves it. And I love Stillwell's ultra-dramatic exit. "You'll never see me again." Now Connors has to pay for irresponsibly monkeying with science by never being cured of his own mutation disease. Scorpion pays for his crimes by remaining trapped in a suit we've seen him take off, and Toombs, certainly the worst of the three, is trapped as a flying man-spider. And Peter gets to continue being Spider-Man, with all the headaches and personal difficulties that causes, like not always being there for the people he loves, but without the fear of losing his humanity. But while it feels like he's earned this gift, and I like that it's just the hard life he had in the first place, it's not perpetual bliss or anything, there's some moral ambiguity on his part that's never addressed. Connor is constantly pushing neogenics after all the terrible things it's brought, namely Morbius, and his motives seem totally selfish, thus his fate here. But Spider-Man was exactly the same way, and in this episode. When Connors gets his grant and opens Dexter's laboratory, Peter thinks at the audience, "Neogenics lives!" which is corny enough to warrant some kind of punishment on its own, but it bugs me that it never seems to occur to him that maybe this science is too dangerous to be practiced, and he has the same attitude Connors does, wanting the science to continue solely for his own ends. He doesn't exactly do anything with that attitude, but I wish he felt something about it by the end. He's lucky that science, however the heck it works, saved him, but he should feel the same way about it as Stillwell, who nearly loses his mind and is not Stillwell when we catch up to him here, wrought with grief for what he's created. But back to, praising an episode I included on a best of list, I also like this one for the relationship stuff, which is as well-handed as it ever is in this show. First, we actually see it unfolding, on screen, and characters are acting a little like real people. I like Peter helping Flash Thompson realize Deborah is into him, despite the differences Peter has had with him. I like seeing two people in this show develop a friendship before a romance, and one of them gradually figuring out his feelings, rather than this Harlequin romance novel love at first sight nonsense we tend to do. And I like seeing the fruits of Spider-Man's labors in Flash, who lives by the example Spider-Man has set, putting his own life on the line for his friends, and ignoring Spider-Man's orders, ultimately saving Spider-Man himself when the Vulture paralyzes him and almost blows him up. Whew, that was lucky. I'm gonna start keeping my high school bullies around too, just in case. Yeah, it gets bizarre and goofy, and the wrap-up is real contrived, but there's some heart here this show is often lacking, especially with the old versus young stuff. I like Jameson's super hypocritical line, "Why is it having no responsibility goes hand in hand with being young?" Here, our young characters are maturing and growing, and our older characters are out of touch and self-absorbed. It makes a pretty good case against that as a hard and fast rule. Okay, just 5 more of these left to go. Just gotta sit down and take out my still shots, take some notes, write my review. Just, Hulu? Hulu?